I was halfway through loading my work van when Patricia Morrison appeared at the end of my driveway like a vulture circling roadkill. The morning sun hadn't even cleared the peaks of Boulder, Colorado, and already my day was about to go sideways. She clutched her tablet against her designer blazer, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the screen with that rhythmic impatience that made my jaw clench. "Carter Zimmerman," she called out, her voice carrying that particular pitch of manufactured authority that only HOA board presidents seem to master. "I need to speak with you about a serious violation." I set down the medical supply box I'd been carrying and turned to face her. "Morning, Patricia." "What's the issue?" She strode up my driveway like she owned it, which in her mind she probably thought she did. The Pinewood Ridge Homeowners Association had been a thorn in my side since I'd moved into this neighborhood 3 years ago. But Patricia had taken the position of president last fall and transformed minor annoyances into full-blown warfare. "This," she said, gesturing dramatically toward my open garage. "Those chains hanging on your wall are in violation of HOA Code Section 14.7, subsection B. Hazardous materials and dangerous equipment must not be stored in plain view where they might endanger other residents or decrease property values." I followed her pointing finger to the snow chains I'd hung neatly on hooks the previous evening. They were professional-grade chains, the kind designed for serious mountain driving, and they'd cost me nearly $800. I needed them for my job, but explaining that to Patricia would require her to actually listen, which wasn't her strong suit. "Those are snow chains," I said, keeping my voice level. "For my tires. They're not hazardous. They're heavy metal chains with sharp edges. A child could get hurt. A pet could become entangled. The HOA board has determined they constitute a safety hazard." She tapped her tablet again. "You have 24 hours to remove them from view, or we'll be forced to confiscate them and issue a fine." "Confiscate them?" I couldn't hide the disbelief in my voice. "You can't just take my property." "Actually, according to the covenant you signed when purchasing your home, the HOA has the right to remove any items deemed dangerous or detrimental to the community." She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that told me she'd been waiting to use that particular power. "24 hours, Mr. Zimmerman. Have a pleasant day." She turned and walked back down my driveway, leaving me standing there with my mouth half open. I looked back at the chains. They were just chains. Good, solid, necessary chains that I needed for the job I was heading to write at that moment. I worked as a specialized medical courier for Rocky Mountain Emergency Logistics. We delivered critical medical supplies, equipment, and sometimes even organs to remote locations throughout Colorado. During winter, that meant driving to places where normal delivery services refused to go. Mountain rescue teams, remote clinics, backcountry emergency stations. They all depended on people like me to get supplies through when weather turned nasty. That particular morning, I had a delivery scheduled for the Pike National Forest Rescue Station, about 90 miles away. The forecast called for snow in the high elevations, which meant those chains weren't just recommended, they were potentially life-saving. My own life, and the lives of whoever needed those medical supplies. I finished loading the van, making sure the insulated cargo area was properly secured. Then I went back into my garage, grabbed the chains and put them in the van. If Patricia wanted them out of sight, fine. They'd be more useful in my vehicle anyway. The drive up to the mountains was beautiful that morning. February in Colorado meant the peaks were still heavy with snow, and the pine trees looked like something from a postcard. I'd taken this route dozens of times, knew every switchback and steep grade. The roads were clear until about elevation 7,000 feet, and then I started seeing patches of ice. By the time I reached 8,000 feet, snow was falling steadily. I pulled into a turnout and spent 15 minutes installing the chains, my breath fogging in the cold air. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since leaving Boulder, and my fingers were numb by the time I finished securing them. But once they were on, the van gripped the road like it was dry pavement. The rescue station sat another 1,000 feet up, accessible only by a winding Forest Service road that hadn't been plowed yet. Without the chains, I wouldn't have made it 50 yards. With them, I powered through 8 inches of fresh snow and delivered 3 cases of medical supplies, including blood plasma and emergency medications that the station commander said they'd been waiting on for 2 days. "You're the only courier service that actually shows up when we need you," he told me, helping me unload. "Everyone else calls off when the weather gets bad, but that's exactly when we need this stuff most." I thought about Patricia and her safety hazard concerns. If she could see where these chains actually took me, maybe she'd understand, but probably not. I made it home by early afternoon, the chains still on because the snow had followed me down the mountain. I pulled into my garage, planning to clean and store them properly once they dried. Then I headed inside for lunch and some paperwork. 2 hours later, I came back out to start removing the chains, and they were gone. Not just the chains. The hooks I'd mounted on the wall were gone too, leaving 4 drill holes in the drywall where they'd been ripped out. I stood there staring at the empty space, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. I walked down to the end of my driveway and looked around. Mrs. Chen from across the street was getting her mail. "Did you see anyone at my house this afternoon?" I called out. She nodded. "The HOA people. They had a truck. Took something from your garage. I figured you knew about it." The anger that washed over me was immediate and hot. I pulled out my phone and called the number listed on the HOA website. It rang 4 times before someone picked up. "Pinewood Ridge HOA, this is Deborah speaking." "This is Carter Zimmerman. Someone from the HOA just broke into my garage and stole my property. I need to know where my snow chains are right now." There was a pause, then the sound of papers shuffling. "Let me check the enforcement log." "Yes, I see here that Patricia Morrison authorized the removal of hazardous equipment from your property at 2:15 this afternoon. The items have been impounded pending your compliance with HOA regulations. She broke into my garage. That's illegal." "Actually, Mr. Zimmerman, according to your covenant, the HOA has the right to enter your property to address safety violations. You were notified this morning and failed to comply within the stated time frame." The time frame was 24 hours. It's been less than 6. Another pause. "Well, the board deemed the situation urgent enough to require immediate action. You can retrieve your items once you've paid the fine and provided proof that you have proper storage that complies with HOA standards." "How much is the fine?" $500 for the initial violation, plus $75 per day storage fee for the impounded items. I ended the call before I said something I'd regret. $500, plus they were holding my equipment hostage and charging me for the privilege. Equipment I needed for work. Equipment that had cost me $800 and was essential for doing my job safely. I called my boss, Marcus Webb, and explained the situation. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Can you rent chains when you need them?" "Sure, but that's expensive and time-consuming. Most places don't have the commercial grade we need, and I've got another mountain run scheduled for tomorrow morning." "Do what you need to do for tomorrow. But Carter, you need to get this sorted out. We can't have our equipment held hostage by some power-tripping HOA." After hanging up, I drove to the nearest auto shop that carried heavy-duty chains. They had one set left that would fit my van, but they were lower quality than what I preferred and cost me $350. Money I shouldn't have had to spend. That evening, I started researching Colorado HOA laws. I'd signed the covenant when I bought the house, sure, but there had to be limits on what they could actually do. Breaking into someone's garage and taking their property felt like it crossed several legal lines. I discovered that HOAs in Colorado did have broad powers, but they were supposed to follow due process. They needed to provide written notice, allow time for compliance, and hold hearings before taking enforcement action. Patricia's 24-hour verbal warning, followed by entering my garage 6 hours later, didn't seem to meet any of those requirements. I also found a Colorado statute about theft that made my situation interesting. Even if the HOA had some claim to enforcement rights, taking someone's property without following proper procedures could still constitute theft or trespassing. The law didn't just disappear because an HOA said so. The next morning, I had to be on the road by 5 a.m. for a delivery to a wilderness medical camp near Aspen. The new chains worked, but they didn't feel as secure as my good ones. Every turn on the icy roads made me hyper-aware of the difference. I made the delivery safely, but the whole time I kept thinking about Patricia Morrison helping herself to my garage like she owned it. When I got home that afternoon, there was a letter taped to my front door. Official HOA stationery, with multiple paragraphs of dense text explaining my violations and the consequences. At the bottom, Patricia had signed her name with a flourish. The letter stated that, in addition to the initial $500 fine, I was being charged with an additional violation for continuing to store hazardous materials, because the new chains were visible in my van through the garage door opening. Another $300 fine. They were also demanding that I install a solid garage door cover or keep the door closed at all times. I called an attorney that evening. His name was Roger Pemberton, and he'd handled a few HOA disputes before. I explained the situation, and he listened without interrupting. "Here's the thing," he said when I finished. HOAs can be tough to fight because courts generally defer to their authority within the covenants, but they still have to follow basic property law. Breaking into your garage and taking your equipment without proper notice or a hearing. That's problematic. So what do I do? First, document everything. Photos, timelines, copies of all communications. Second, file a police report for theft. Make them acknowledge that your property was taken without your permission. Third, send a formal demand letter to the HOA requiring return of your property and reimbursement for the replacement chains. We'll cite the specific covenant violations they committed in the process. I spent the next hour writing out a detailed timeline of events and gathering documentation. Then I drove to the Boulder Police Department to file a report. The officer who took my statement was a tired-looking woman named Officer Ramirez. She typed as I talked, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "So the HOA president entered your garage and removed property without your permission," she summarized, "and you want to file theft charges?" "Yes." She looked at me over her computer screen. "Have you read your HOA covenant, parts of it?" "My attorney says that even with the covenant, they can't just break in and take things." "That's between you and your attorney, but I'll file the report." She went back to typing. "Be aware that this might be considered a civil matter rather than criminal theft. The DA will make that call." "I understand. I just need it on record that my property was taken." She printed out the report and handed me a copy. "Good luck with your HOA. I've heard stories about some of these boards. They can get pretty aggressive." That was an understatement. 2 days later, I had another mountain delivery scheduled, this one to a rescue team staging area near Breckenridge. It was a routine run, except that when I got home, I found my garage door wouldn't open. Someone had put a padlock on the exterior handle, preventing it from lifting. I walked around the lock, examining it. It was industrial grade, the kind used on storage units. There was a tag attached with the HOA logo and a phone number. I called immediately. Deborah answered again. "Why is there a lock on my garage door?" "The HOA board determined that you were in violation of the garage door policy. Since you refuse to keep it closed or install proper screening, we've helped ensure compliance. You can't lock my garage. That's my property. I need access to it." "You have access through your interior door, Mr. Zimmerman. The exterior access is locked to prevent you from continuing to display prohibited items." "This is insane. You're going to remove that lock right now, or I'm cutting it off. If you damage HOA property, you'll be fined for vandalism." "The lock will be removed once you've paid your outstanding fines and signed an agreement to comply with all HOA regulations going forward." I cut the lock off with bolt cutters 10 minutes later. I didn't care about their threats anymore. This had crossed so far beyond reasonable that I was done playing along. The next morning, there was another letter. This one informed me that I was being fined $1,000 for destruction of HOA property, and that my case was being referred to the board for additional sanctions, potentially including a lien on my property. That's when things got really interesting. I called Roger, my attorney, and told him about the lock and the escalating fines. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "They're trying to force you into compliance through financial pressure. The problem is, if you don't pay, they can eventually put a lien on your house. Colorado law allows HOAs to do that for unpaid fines and assessments. So what's my option? Just pay them whatever they demand? No, we fight back, but we need to do it smartly. First, I'm going to send them a cease and desist letter, demanding they stop interfering with your property and return your chains. Second, we're going to request all HOA board meeting minutes for the past year, plus their enforcement policies. I want to see if they're applying these rules consistently or just targeting you. They're definitely targeting me. Half the garages in this neighborhood have stuff visible. Bikes, tools, you name it. Perfect. Selective enforcement is one of the strongest arguments against an HOA. If they're not applying the rules equally, they're violating their own covenant." Roger sent the cease and desist letter that afternoon. 2 days later, Patricia called me directly. "Mr. Zimmerman, this is Patricia Morrison. I received a very hostile letter from your attorney, making all sorts of baseless accusations." "They're not baseless. You broke into my garage, stole my property, and locked my garage door. That's not HOA enforcement, that's harassment. I'm trying to maintain property values and safety in this neighborhood. Your refusal to follow simple rules is making my job very difficult. My snow chains aren't hurting anyone. I need them for work. I deliver medical supplies to mountain rescue teams." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You deliver what? Medical supplies? Emergency equipment to rescue teams in the mountains. That's why I have professional-grade snow chains. They're not decorative. They're essential equipment." "That's not what your listed occupation says on your HOA application." "My application says I'm a medical courier. That's exactly what I just described." "Well, regardless of your occupation, the rules apply to everyone equally. If I make an exception for you, I'd have to make exceptions for everyone. You're already making exceptions. Tom Patterson 3 houses down has a motorcycle in his garage that's visible from the street. The Hendersons have landscaping equipment. The couple on the corner have their entire garage set up as a workshop with tools everywhere. Those are different situations. How? How are they different? I don't have to explain the board's decision-making process to you, Mr. Zimmerman. Either pay your fines and comply with the rules, or face additional sanctions. She hung up before I could respond. That weekend, I started talking to my neighbors. Not in any organized way, just casual conversations while checking mail or walking to my van. Turns out, I wasn't the only one who'd had problems with Patricia and her board. The Rodriguezes had been fined for having a wreath on their door that exceeded the maximum allowed diameter by 2 inches. The fine was $250. Mrs. Chen had been cited for parking her car on the street overnight when her garage door opener broke. Even though she'd called a repair company and it was being fixed the next day, the fine was $300. A young couple, the Martins, had been fined $500 for painting their front door without prior approval. The new color was virtually identical to the old color, both within the approved palette, but they hadn't submitted the proper paperwork first. Everyone had stories. Everyone was angry, but most people had just paid the fines because fighting the HOA seemed futile and expensive. "Why don't we all push back together?" I suggested to Mrs. Chen while she told me about her parking fine. She shook her head. "I'm retired and on a fixed income. I can't afford attorney fees, and I can't risk them putting a lien on my house. It's easier to just pay and try to stay off their radar." That was exactly what Patricia was counting on. Individual homeowners were isolated and vulnerable. The HOA had money from everyone's dues, which meant they could afford to fight legal battles that individual owners couldn't. But I was getting mad enough that I didn't care about the cost anymore. The following Monday, I had a delivery to a mountain rescue training facility near Vail. The head of the facility, a man named David Cordova, had been getting deliveries from me for over a year. We'd developed a friendly professional relationship. While he signed for the medical equipment, he noticed I seemed distracted. "Everything okay, Carter?" I gave him the short version of what was happening with my HOA. He listened, his expression growing more incredulous as I talked. "Wait, they took your snow chains, the ones you need to reach places like this?" "Yep, said they were a safety hazard." That's the most backwards thing I've ever heard. Those chains probably save lives indirectly. If you can't deliver emergency supplies because you don't have proper equipment, people could die. That hadn't really occurred to me in such stark terms, but he was right. The supplies I delivered weren't optional. They were emergency medications, blood products, rescue equipment. Delays could have serious consequences. "Would you be willing to write a letter explaining that?" I asked. "My attorney is building a case against the HOA, and it might help to show that the chains aren't just for convenience." "Absolutely. I'll write it today. And I'll have the regional director add a letter too. We've got 3 other couriers who service this region, but none of them have your reliability in bad weather. That's specifically because of your equipment and experience." He was true to his word. By the end of the week, Roger had letters from David, the regional rescue director, and 2 other emergency facilities I serviced regularly. All of them stated that my snow chains were essential equipment for emergency services, and that my deliveries had been critical for their operations. Roger incorporated these letters into a formal demand package he sent to the HOA board. He requested an immediate board hearing to address my case and demanded return of my original chains plus reimbursement for the replacement chains, the cut lock, and any other expenses I'd incurred. The board scheduled a hearing for 3 weeks out. In the meantime, Patricia wasn't backing down. I received another violation notice, this time for having my work van parked in my driveway during daylight hours. Apparently, commercial vehicles were only allowed to be in the neighborhood between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. The fine was $400. I'd parked in my driveway at 4:30 in the afternoon after an early day. I'd been inside for maybe 15 minutes when the notice was taped to my door. She was watching my house. That was the only explanation. Patricia or someone working for her was actively monitoring my property looking for violations. I mentioned this to Roger, and he made a note of it. Harassment and selective enforcement. Keep track of every incident. Dates, times, what happened. Also, start taking photos of other garages and driveways in the neighborhood. Document any visible items or commercial vehicles. We need to show the pattern. I spent a Saturday morning walking through the neighborhood with my phone, photographing garage interiors visible from the street. Tools, bikes, storage boxes, sports equipment, even another set of snow chains in one garage. I photographed 3 different commercial vehicles, including a plumber's van and a landscaping truck, parked in driveways during prohibited hours. Patricia saw me taking photos. She came out of her house, which was at the far end of the neighborhood, and marched over to where I was standing. "What do you think you're doing?" Documenting HOA compliance throughout the neighborhood. "Just being thorough. You can't photograph people's homes without permission." "I'm photographing visible violations of HOA rules, the same rules you've been citing me for. I'm standing on public streets, so yes, I can take these photos." Her face went red. "You're creating a hostile environment in this neighborhood. I'm showing that the rules are being enforced selectively. If I'm getting fined for visible garage items and daytime commercial vehicles, then so should everyone else. That's not how this works. The board exercises discretion in enforcement. Discretion that seems to focus entirely on my property. That's called harassment, Patricia." She stepped closer, and I could see her jaw clenching. "You think you're clever, don't you? Getting your attorney involved, collecting your little evidence. But you signed a covenant when you bought here. You agreed to follow our rules. And the board has every right to enforce them however we see fit. Actually, you don't. You have to enforce them consistently and fairly, and you have to follow proper procedures, which you haven't done. We'll see what the board decides at your hearing. I've got 3 years of experience running this HOA, and I've never lost an enforcement case. You're not going to be the first." She walked away, but something about the encounter left me feeling uneasy. She wasn't just confident. She was almost gleeful, like she knew something I didn't. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday evening at 7 p.m., held in the clubhouse meeting room. I arrived with Roger at 6:50 and found the room already set up like a courtroom. There was a long table at the front where 5 board members sat, with Patricia in the center position. Folding chairs faced them for the audience, and a small table to the side for me and Roger. About 15 other homeowners were scattered in the audience chairs. I recognized most of them as people I'd talked to about their own HOA problems. Patricia called the meeting to order at exactly 7 p.m. She read through some standard procedural language, then said, "We're here tonight to address multiple violations by Mr. Carter Zimmerman of 2847 Pinecrest Drive. Mr. Zimmerman has repeatedly refused to comply with HOA regulations regarding storage of hazardous materials, garage door policies, and commercial vehicle restrictions. The board will hear evidence and determine appropriate sanctions." Roger stood. "Before we proceed, I'd like to clarify the purpose of this hearing. We're not here to defend against violations. We're here to challenge the HOA's illegal seizure of my client's property and harassment through selective enforcement. One of the other board members, a thin man whose nameplate said Richard, spoke up. This hearing is to address Mr. Zimmerman's violations, not to put the HOA on trial. Actually, when the HOA violates its own covenants and Colorado property law, that's exactly what needs to happen. We have substantial evidence of improper procedures and selective enforcement. Patricia's expression tightened. You'll have an opportunity to present your defense after we've outlined the violations. The next 20 minutes were brutal. Patricia went through a PowerPoint presentation showing photos of my garage, my van, and even some pictures of me installing snow chains in a parking area, which she'd apparently had someone follow me to document. She described each violation in detail, emphasizing the danger posed by the chains, the unsightliness of the commercial vehicle, and my repeated refusal to comply. She made it sound like I was running a junkyard out of my garage and endangering the entire neighborhood. When she finished, Roger stood and connected his laptop to the projector. "Let me show you what selective enforcement looks like," he said, and pulled up the photos I'd taken of other garages and vehicles in the neighborhood. He went through them methodically. Tools visible in the Henderson garage, not cited. Landscaping equipment in the Patterson garage, not cited. Motorcycle in the Wilson garage, not cited. Commercial plumbing van parked at the Rodriguez house during prohibited hours, not cited. Commercial landscaping truck at the Chen house, not cited. Every one of these is a violation of the same rules you're citing my client for, but none of these homeowners have been fined or had their property seized. Why is that? Patricia shifted in her chair. Those situations were addressed through warnings. Mr. Zimmerman refused to comply even after being warned. He was given 6 hours' notice before you entered his garage and took his property. Your own covenant requires written notice and a minimum of 30 days for compliance before enforcement action. The situation was deemed urgent due to safety concerns. Roger smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "Let's talk about safety. I have letters here from 4 emergency rescue facilities describing how Mr. Zimmerman's snow chains are essential equipment for delivering life-saving medical supplies to mountain locations. These chains aren't decorative or hobby equipment. They're professional tools used in support of emergency services." He distributed copies of the letters to each board member. Patricia barely glanced at hers. That may be true, but the rules don't make exceptions based on someone's occupation. No, but the rules do require consistent enforcement and proper procedures. You've failed on both counts. Roger pulled out another document. This is a police report filed by Mr. Zimmerman for theft of his property. The investigating officer noted that HOA covenants don't override basic property law. You entered his garage without permission and removed items without following proper notification procedures. Richard, the thin board member, looked uncomfortable. "Patricia, did we follow the standard notification process on this?" The safety concern justified immediate action, Patricia insisted. "That's not what our covenant says." Another board member, a woman named Susan, spoke up. "I've reviewed the documents Mr. Pemberton sent over. He's right that we're supposed to provide written notice and allow 30 days for compliance before taking enforcement action." Patricia shot Susan a sharp look. The board president has discretion to act in emergency situations. "Snow chains hanging on a garage wall aren't an emergency," Roger said. "And even if they were, the proper procedure would be to seek a temporary restraining order through the courts, not to break into someone's garage and take their property." The hearing continued for another hour. Roger presented evidence of the harassment, the excessive fines, the pattern of targeting me specifically. He showed that my work van met all the requirements for a commercial vehicle in the covenant, that the snow chains were properly stored until the HOA took them, and that everything I'd done was consistent with how other homeowners in the neighborhood operated. By the end, 3 of the 5 board members looked distinctly uncomfortable. Patricia remained stone-faced, and Richard seemed to be backing her play, but the other 3 were clearly having second thoughts. Finally, Susan said, "I move that we table this matter and have an executive session to review the procedures and evidence before making a decision." Richard objected, but the other 2 board members sided with Susan. The motion passed 3-2 with Patricia voting against it. Patricia adjourned the meeting with visible frustration. As people filed out, several neighbors approached me to say they hoped I'd win. A few even mentioned they'd had similar problems with Patricia's enforcement tactics. Outside in the parking lot, Roger was optimistic. That went better than expected. The fact that 3 board members want to review things means they're concerned about liability. If they're smart, they'll return your chains and drop the fines. And if they're not smart, then we file a lawsuit and probably win. But litigation is expensive and slow. Let's hope they see reason. 3 days later, I received a letter from the HOA. It was signed by Susan, not Patricia, and it stated that after careful review, the board had determined that some procedural errors had occurred in my case. My original snow chains would be returned, all fines would be waived, and the HOA would be revising its enforcement procedures to ensure better compliance with the covenant requirements. I felt a surge of relief. It was over. I'd won. The chains were returned the next day, dropped off at my house by a clearly reluctant Patricia, who didn't say a word beyond asking me to sign a receipt confirming I'd received them. I checked them over carefully. They were undamaged, still in good condition. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, I came home from a delivery run to find my house had been broken into. The front door lock was damaged, forced open. Inside, the place had been ransacked. Drawers pulled out, closets emptied, furniture moved. I called the police immediately. Officer Ramirez responded, the same officer who'd taken my theft report against the HOA. "Anything missing?" she asked while examining the damage. I walked through the house carefully. My TV was still there, laptop still on my desk. Cash I kept in a drawer for emergencies still there. Nothing obvious was gone. I can't find anything missing, but someone definitely went through everything. Any idea who might want to do this? I hesitated, then said, "I just had a big dispute with my HOA president. It ended badly for her." Officer Ramirez raised an eyebrow. "You think she broke into your house?" "I don't know, but the timing is suspicious." She took a full report and said they'd look into it, but without any evidence or witnesses, she wasn't optimistic about solving it. I called Roger and told him what happened. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "This could be retaliation. Do you have any security cameras?" "No. Never needed them before." "Get some. Today if possible, and document everything about this break-in. If there's any connection to the HOA, we need to be able to prove it." I spent that afternoon installing a basic security camera system. 2 cameras covering the front and back of the house, motion activated, uploading to cloud storage. It wasn't professional grade, but it was better than nothing. For 3 days, nothing unusual happened. Then, on the 4th night, my motion alerts went off at 2 a.m. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the camera app. A figure in dark clothing was walking up my driveway toward my garage. I called the police while watching the feed. The figure tried my garage door, found it locked, then moved to a side window. Before they could do anything else, I heard sirens approaching. The figure ran. 2 police cars arrived within minutes. I showed them the video footage and they searched the area but didn't find anyone. However, they were able to get a decent image of the person from my security camera. The build and height looked right for Patricia, but the face was covered and the footage wasn't clear enough to make a positive ID. Officer Ramirez came by the next morning to follow up. I showed her the footage again on my computer where it was clearer. "That's pretty bold, coming back after breaking in once," she said. "You're sure about the HOA connection?" "I don't know what else to think. I don't have any other enemies. I don't owe anyone money. There's no reason for someone to target me like this, except for the HOA dispute. The problem is, without a clear identification, I can't arrest anyone. The build could fit half the women in Boulder. Do you have any other evidence linking this to Patricia Morrison specifically?" I didn't. Just suspicion and timing. Officer Ramirez suggested I get a restraining order, but that required proof of harassment or threats that I couldn't quite establish. The break-in was a crime, but without proof of who did it, it was just an unsolved case. I upgraded my security system that afternoon to include higher resolution cameras and better lighting. I also installed sensors on all my windows and doors. If someone tried to get in again, I'd know immediately. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following week. It was a regular monthly meeting, open to all homeowners. I decided to attend. About 30 people showed up, which was unusual. Normally, these meetings drew maybe 10. Word had spread about my case, and people were paying attention. Patricia ran through the standard agenda items, her tone clipped and professional. When she got to new business, I raised my hand. "I'd like to address the board about a safety concern." She looked like she wanted to refuse, but with so many people present, she nodded. I stood. 2 weeks ago, my house was broken into. Nothing was taken, but the place was thoroughly searched. A few days ago, someone attempted to break in again, and I have security footage of it. Both incidents occurred after my dispute with the HOA was resolved. I'm concerned that someone might be retaliating against me for challenging the board's enforcement actions. The room went silent. Everyone was looking at Patricia. "That's unfortunate," she said carefully, "but it has nothing to do with the HOA. Maybe, but the timing is suspicious. And I'm not the only one who's had problems after challenging HOA decisions. I've spoken to other homeowners who have experienced similar harassment." Susan, the board member who'd sided with me before, leaned forward. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Zimmerman?" "I'm suggesting that someone associated with the HOA might be engaging in illegal retaliation. I'm suggesting that the board should be aware of this pattern and take it seriously." Richard jumped in. "You can't just make accusations without evidence." "I'm not accusing anyone specifically. I'm reporting a pattern of events and asking the board to address it." Patricia's face had gone very still. "If you believe a crime has been committed, you should report it to the police, not bring it to an HOA meeting." "I have reported it to the police. I'm also reporting it to the board because I believe there's a connection to HOA business." An older man in the back stood up. "I had my tires slashed last year after I challenged a fine. Never could prove who did it, but it happened 2 days after my hearing." A woman on the left side raised her hand. "Someone went through my trash and left it scattered all over my lawn. That was right after I complained about being fined for having the wrong color mailbox." More people started speaking up. Story after story of minor vandalism, harassment, strange incidents that happened after challenging the HOA or Patricia specifically. Patricia was losing control of the meeting. She tried to call for order, but people kept talking, sharing experiences, connecting dots. Finally, Susan held up her hand. "This is serious. If there's a pattern of retaliation connected to HOA enforcement, we need to investigate it." "There's nothing to investigate," Patricia snapped. "These are random incidents being connected by conspiracy theories." "Are they random?" Susan challenged, "because what I'm hearing suggests otherwise." The meeting devolved into arguments. Eventually, Patricia adjourned early, citing the disruption. But something had shifted. The board was divided and homeowners were starting to organize. Over the next few days, I coordinated with some of the neighbors who'd spoken up at the meeting. We started a group chat, sharing information about incidents and problems. A pattern emerged that was even clearer than I'd realized. Anyone who challenged Patricia or the board faced some kind of retaliation within days or weeks. Sometimes it was additional HOA fines for minor violations. Sometimes it was vandalism or harassment. The tactics varied, but the timing was consistent. One of the neighbors, a software engineer named Marcus, created a spreadsheet documenting all the incidents. Dates, descriptions, what HOA action preceded them. It was damning. I gave the spreadsheet to Officer Ramirez. She reviewed it carefully, then said, "This is interesting, but it's still mostly circumstantial. Unless someone comes forward with direct knowledge of who's behind these incidents, there's not much we can do criminally. What if we set up surveillance? If someone tries to vandalize or harass again, we catch them on camera. That's your right. But be careful. Don't put yourself in danger trying to catch someone." I didn't have to wait long. 3 nights later, my motion sensors went off at 1 a.m. I checked the cameras and saw the same figure from before approaching my house. This time, they were carrying something that looked like a can of spray paint. I called 911 immediately and gave them the address. While I was on the phone, the figure spray painted something on my garage door, then ran toward the street where a car was waiting. My camera caught the license plate. When the police arrived, I showed them the footage. The license plate was clearly visible, and they ran it immediately. It came back registered to Richard Paulson, the board member who'd been backing Patricia's enforcement actions. Officer Ramirez looked at me with new interest. "Now we've got something concrete. That's his car and that's vandalism on video. I'll need a copy of this footage." They went to Richard's house that night. I wasn't there, but I heard about it later from Officer Ramirez. Richard denied everything at first, said his car must have been borrowed. But when they pointed out that the figure's build matched his, and that he had no alibi for the time of the vandalism, he started to crack. Eventually, he admitted to the spray painting. He also admitted to the previous attempted break-in, though he claimed the actual break-in had been someone else. "Who?" Officer Ramirez asked him. That's when he gave up Patricia. According to Richard's statement, Patricia had orchestrated a campaign of harassment against multiple homeowners who challenged the board. She'd recruited Richard and one other person, a woman named Carol who worked as the HOA's administrative assistant, to carry out various acts of vandalism and intimidation. The break-in at my house had been Patricia looking for any evidence I might have against the HOA. The tire slashing, the scattered trash, several other incidents all tied back to her direction. Richard claimed he'd only gone along with it because Patricia had convinced him they were protecting the neighborhood from troublemakers. He seemed to realize how ridiculous that sounded even as he said it. Patricia was arrested the next morning at her house. The charges included criminal trespass, theft, vandalism, and conspiracy to commit harassment. Carol was arrested an hour later on similar charges. The story made the local news. HOA president arrested for harassment campaign. It was the lead story on 3 different channels. I got calls from reporters, which I didn't answer. Roger advised me to stay quiet until the criminal cases were resolved. But I did watch the coverage. which included interviews with other homeowners who'd been targeted. The neighborhood I'd thought was just typical suburban Denver turned out to have been living under a regime of intimidation for years. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove Patricia as president and from the board entirely. Susan became interim president. They also suspended Carol and announced they'd be hiring a property management company to handle day-to-day operations going forward. The criminal cases moved slowly, as they do. But by late spring, Richard had pleaded guilty to vandalism and criminal mischief in exchange for probation and community service. He cooperated fully with prosecutors, providing detailed testimony about Patricia's role. Patricia fought the charges initially, claiming Richard was lying and that she'd never directed anyone to do anything illegal. But the evidence was overwhelming. Text messages between her and Richard discussing problem homeowners. Financial records showing she'd paid Carol cash for special projects. Testimony from multiple neighbors about the pattern of retaliation. In the end, she accepted a plea deal too. She was sentenced to 6 months in jail followed by 2 years of probation, plus restitution to all the homeowners she'd harassed. The judge was particularly harsh about abuse of authority and using an HOA position to target residents. During her sentencing hearing, the judge said, "You were entrusted with a position of limited authority within a homeowners association. Instead of using that position responsibly, you created a climate of fear and engaged in criminal behavior against the very people you were supposed to serve." This court takes such abuse of trust very seriously. Patricia showed no emotion during the sentencing. She'd maintained throughout that she'd been protecting property values and neighborhood standards. Even facing jail time, she couldn't seem to grasp that what she'd done was wrong. The civil fallout was significant too. Multiple homeowners, including me, filed a class action lawsuit against the HOA for the harassment and illegal enforcement actions. The HOA's insurance carrier settled for a substantial sum rather than go to trial. My portion covered my attorney fees, the cost of my replacement chains, my security system, and damages for the stress and harassment. More importantly, the settlement required the HOA to completely overhaul its enforcement procedures. They had to implement checks and balances, create an appeals process, and ensure consistent application of rules. Susan worked hard to make those changes real and meaningful. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Without Patricia's aggressive enforcement, people relaxed. Garage doors were left open without fear. Minor violations went unnoticed or were handled with friendly reminders rather than fines. It felt like a community again, instead of a prison camp. I continued my work delivering medical supplies to mountain rescue teams. My snow chains hung on their hooks in my garage, visible to anyone who looked. No one complained. In fact, after the news coverage, several neighbors mentioned they thought it was cool that I did that kind of work. David Cordova, the rescue station commander, called me a few months after everything settled down. "I saw the news about your HOA situation," he said. "Sounds like it got pretty crazy." That's an understatement. "Well, I wanted you to know that we appreciate you sticking with the deliveries through all of that. Some of the other couriers mentioned that their HOAs give them grief too. Not to the same extent, but enough to make the job harder. It's worth it. What you guys do up there matters. So does what you do. Don't forget that." It was a good reminder. The whole situation with Patricia and the HOA had been so consuming that I'd lost sight of why I had those snow chains in the first place. They weren't just tools. They were a link in a chain of emergency services that saved lives. One Saturday in June, I organized a neighborhood barbecue. Nothing fancy, just burgers and hot dogs in the community park. About 40 people showed up, which was more than I'd hoped for. Susan gave a short speech thanking everyone for their patience during the transition and promising that the new board would focus on community building rather than rule enforcement. People actually applauded. Mrs. Chen brought homemade dumplings. The Rodriguezes brought their kids and a piñata. Tom Patterson showed up on his motorcycle, which he parked right in the middle of the parking lot, visible to everyone. Nobody cared. It felt like we'd reclaimed something that had been taken from us. Not just the freedom from harassment, but the basic sense of being neighbors instead of subjects. Roger stopped by for a bit, mostly because I'd invited him, and he was curious to see the neighborhood that had generated so much legal drama. He seemed pleased with how things had turned out. "You know, most HOA cases don't end this cleanly," he told me while we stood by the grill. "Usually, people just pay the fines and move on, or they move away. What you did, organizing people and pushing back, that's rare. I just wanted my chains back." It was never just about the chains, though. It was about the principle. About not letting someone abuse authority just because they technically have it. He was right, of course. If Patricia had just asked me to store the chains differently or worked with me to find a solution, none of this would have happened. But she'd seen an opportunity to exert control, and she'd taken it too far. The last I heard about Patricia, she'd moved to Arizona after completing her jail sentence. Apparently, she'd bought a condo in a community with no HOA at all. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Richard had moved away too, though I wasn't sure where. The shame of being prosecuted for spray painting his neighbor's garage as part of an HOA harassment campaign had been too much. He'd sold his house and left town while still on probation. Carol, the administrative assistant, had served her sentence and was apparently working retail somewhere in Denver. She'd written an apology letter to all the affected homeowners, which seemed genuine enough. Of the three of them, she seemed the most likely to actually learn from what had happened. As for me, life went back to normal. I kept delivering supplies to mountain rescue teams, racking up miles on Colorado's most challenging roads. I kept my snow chains in my garage, properly maintained and ready to go. And I kept living in Pinewood Ridge, which under Susan's leadership became the kind of neighborhood I'd hoped for when I first moved in. The garage door stayed open on nice days. My work van parked in the driveway whenever I was home. Neighbors waved and chatted instead of looking for violations to report. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional and peaceful. On a cold morning in late January, almost a year after Patricia had first appeared at my driveway to complain about the chains, I was loading my van for a delivery to a backcountry rescue station. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, and the mountains looked pristine and beautiful. Susan walked by with her dog and stopped to say hello. "Big delivery?" she asked. "Emergency medical supplies for a rescue training exercise. They need them by noon. Be safe up there. Always am. That's what the chains are for." She smiled and continued her walk. It was such a simple, normal interaction. The kind of thing that should always have been normal but hadn't been for too long. I finished loading, checked my chains one more time to make sure they were secure in the van, and headed out. The roads were clear in Boulder but would get dicey in the mountains. That's why they needed someone with the right equipment and experience. That's why the chains mattered. Patricia had seen them as a violation, a threat to her control and her vision of neighborhood perfection. But they'd never been that. They'd always been tools for an important job, a way to help people in emergencies, a connection to something bigger than property values and HOA regulations. In the end, that's what the whole fight had really been about. Not snow chains or garage storage or commercial vehicle rules, but whether someone could use their authority to diminish what mattered in favor of what was merely convenient for them. I'd pushed back because giving in would have meant accepting that convenience mattered more than necessity, that appearance mattered more than function, that authority mattered more than justice. The chains had been worth fighting for. Not because they cost $800, though that hadn't hurt, but because they represented something fundamental about being able to live your life and do your work without someone else's arbitrary control. As I drove up into the mountains, the snow chains waiting in the back of my van, I felt grateful for how things had turned out. Not just for me, but for all the neighbors who'd been living under Patricia's harassment. We'd stood up, we'd pushed back, and we'd won. The rescue station appeared through the falling snow, a welcome sight at the end of a winding mountain road. I pulled in carefully, the van handling perfectly despite the conditions. By the time I'd parked and started unloading, 2 rescue team members were there to help. "Right on time," one of them said. "We were starting to worry the snow might delay you." "Not with the right equipment," I replied, thinking of the chains that had caused so much trouble and resolved so much more. They helped me unload, signed the delivery receipts, and I headed back down the mountain. The snow was falling harder now, but the roads were manageable. By the time I got back to Boulder, it was early afternoon. The neighborhood looked peaceful under its blanket of fresh snow. I pulled into my driveway and opened the garage door. The hooks where my chains would hang once I removed them from the van were right there, visible to anyone passing by. And that was exactly how it should be.